Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We're pleased to have Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us this week to update us on the top events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I'll turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. Hope you like my new background. Let's start with the most significant event here this week in Israel, which was basically the reports of a meeting. Well, actually, it was confirmed there was a meeting between Israeli Foreign Minister Eli Cohen and the Libyan Foreign Minister. And why was that significant? It was significant for a number of factors: for Israel's place diplomatically, but also for Israeli domestic politics. As someone who sat in the foreign minister's office for 6 years, I can tell you that there's been lots of clandestine meetings with countries that we do not have relations with. Obviously, this was before the Abraham Accords, and a lot of the nations that we now have relations with, the Abraham Accords and others, we had under the table relations, back channels, but there were always conversations, sometimes meetings, but there was always a rule that you do not publicize them. That was not, obviously, for us. Israel is happy to meet with anyone and publicize it and shout it from the rooftops. But for the countries that we're meeting with, there's obviously, understandably, a lot of sensitivity. So it was, very, we had to be very, very careful about these sort of meetings and who knew and who didn't, because there's a whole system in the foreign ministry that, meetings should be put on certain cables. And then there's a level of secrecy that's given, which means that only certain people can know about them, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, the higher level the meeting, especially with those that we don't have formal relationships with, the smaller the circle. Obviously, a country like Libya, it would be extremely tiny, and it would involve probably the prime minister, maybe the head of the National Security Council, maybe the head of the Mossad, because usually the Israeli intelligence agencies are the ones who sometimes are the first sort of line of contact with some of these countries, because sometimes the back channels are formulated on the basis of security needs. Obviously, while we do not have relations with a lot of the Arab world, we do have shared concerns, whether it's about Iran, whether it's about extremism, terrorism, et cetera, and Israel is known that it has helped countries that we don't have relations with, even, sort of formally enemy countries. But it was always done very, very discreetly. It was understood it was done discreetly, or at least that was what we Israelis told ourselves. Around the world, our reputation, Israel's reputation at the official level is not particularly good. There is a lot of understanding that leaks are very common in Israel, and I've sat in many meetings with, dignitaries from around the world, friendly countries, who, would always warn us, this should not be leaked, that should not be leaked, because there's an understanding. If you don't say it, then there's a very good chance that it could come and be a headline the next day, because there's, as one foreign official, I think an American official once said to me, there's off record and there's Israeli off record. Israeli off record doesn't necessarily mean off record. So these things unfortunately happen. Now, why did it happen? There's a few reasons. My particular, as I said, because of my experience, the foreign minister, especially someone like Eli Cohen from Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's party, is in a bit of a quandary. He's got a very senior position as foreign minister. Foreign minister is considered one of the top 3 ministries, along with defense and finance. But it's a ministry where you don't get as much control as you like. Defense ministry also, to a certain extent, as is finance ministry. But foreign ministry is not a ministry which directly affects the average person, or at least that's the way the average person sees it. And especially with a prime minister like Netanyahu, who likes to take control of relations with the US, as he has done, relations with the Arab world, as he has done, or is using Strategic Affairs Minister Ron Dermer, a former senior advisor and someone who's been called Bibi's brain. He's basically Bibi's interlocutor at the highest level. So that leaves Eli Cohen as foreign minister. He doesn't deal with the US, doesn't deal with the Arab world, the Abraham Accords, possible normalization with Saudi Arabia, but he has got the rest of the world. And a lot of foreign ministers will look at that and say, well, what are my achievements? Yes, I'll have a meeting in Uzbekistan. Maybe there'll be a diplomatic, an opening of a diplomatic office in Jerusalem by, Chad or whatever it is, and things like that. But it's not, it's not headline news. So it's possible that there was a lot of pressure, maybe from his advisors, to sort of, okay, this is a big deal to have a meeting with, the foreign minister of Libya is something which, we want to show that Eli Cohen is dining at the top table diplomatically. And basically it was released, and it was obviously a major strategic mistake, a diplomatic blunder, because it's not something you do. The fallout has been immediate. The Libyan foreign minister has basically had to flee the country. Apparently, she's now in Turkey. She's been fired, and the prime minister of Libya had to completely disavow any knowledge of the meeting. It's unlikely he would not have known it, as much as Prime Minister of Israel also would have known about it in advance, even though I do believe that probably Netanyahu didn't know that it would be broadcast, because he's usually more careful about this, even though, as it has been pointed out, he did publicize a meeting he had with MBS of Saudi Arabia a while back, which caused a relatively minor diplomatic fallout, because it's known more publicly, more widely, that there are these sort of meetings with Saudi Arabia. But Libya, especially with the civil war raging there, and because of the sensitivity there, it's a whole different ball game with Libya, and it's put the woman herself, obviously she feels she is in physical danger. She had to leave the country, but what it has done, it's really sent a message across the Arab world that perhaps Israel can't be trusted. Again, it's not that this is necessarily new, but to publicize and to put out an official press statement about such a meeting is pretty unprecedented. And it's something which the US has picked up on. It's something which already the Saudis are certainly uncomfortable with. Again, even though it's well known that negotiations have been taking place with Saudi Arabia, they're at an advanced level, there have been meetings at the highest level. It's still, it makes leaders in the Arab world very uneasy. Some have said that this puts Israel diplomacy back decades. That's a bit of an exaggeration, but it certainly does harm Israel's diplomatic relations, especially with those countries that we don't have diplomatic relations with. We are talking to. It's clear that this was not the first meeting with Libyan officials. It will certainly be the last for a while. I'm sure at some point, especially if things move forward with Saudi Arabia, that others in the Arab world will come forward after, and it may make it easier for Libyans and other Arab countries to come forward. But certainly there'll be quite a lot of fallout from this. But it probably came because partly of the system where there's almost complete control over the higher levels of diplomacy by the prime minister. There's pressure on Israeli officials to get those headlines, to be seen as relevant because of our system. And I've stressed this many, many times in the past. The Israeli system is very unstable. There could be elections tomorrow, which means that there could be primaries within the Likud, which means you've got to stand up and say what you achieved. And foreign minister it's very hard for them to go to the rank and file Likud members and say, look what I achieved. As I said, I opened a trade office here, had a meeting there, attended a conference somewhere else. it's something which doesn't reflect too well amongst the average Likud member, who would then vote in who's going to be where on the list during the next election. So there is a lot of pressure within the system to do it. And I think my particular reading of it is that's what's probably led to that. Moving on from there, another possible diplomatic faux pas this week was by National Security Minister Itamar Ben-Gvir, when he made a statement about the fact that he believes that the security of Israelis living in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, should take precedence over the freedom of movement of Palestinians. Now, that this was taken out of context and used by those who dislike Israel as saying that basically something akin to apartheid, Jews or Israelis, which are primarily Jews in Judea and Samaria, their freedom should be seen as a higher level. He wasn't saying that. He was saying that when it comes to the right to life and the right to movement and freedom of movement, obviously the right to life takes precedence, but it doesn't matter. It went around the world, and we had one of the Haredim sisters who are known to be pretty anti-Israel jumping on it, made a lot of news, but it's certainly something which was brought up by Israel's US interlocutors, something which they were not happy about. But interestingly enough, whereas Netanyahu certainly did come down very strongly against Eli Cohen for his comments and say that from now on, every meeting with an official which Israel doesn't have relations with has to be coordinated with him. Any possible press release has to go through him. Here with Itamar Ben-Gvir, he basically explained it as I did, sort of gave it a bit more context, but didn't come down hard on him. Now, there's a few reasons for that. First of all, because, as I said, it was taken out of context, whereas the Eli Cohen meeting was, as was stated. But also because, whereas Eli Cohen is a member of the Likud, Itamar Ben-Gvir is the leader of a party which Netanyahu needs very much to keep his coalition stable at this point in time, I will say. So he came out with something a lot more measured. He did say, the Palestinian freedom of movement is very important, but also, coming down on security. But we can see here, again, the real difference between Netanyahu, how he relates to members of his party, and how he relates to much needed, but probably not overly liked colleagues within the government. Now, also this week, diplomatically, which sort of plays into this, is news that Saudi Arabia is making overtures towards the Palestinians to try and see what their needs are, especially economically, to try and get them on side for a possible normalization agreement with Israel, Saudi Arabia. That's not going to be signed tomorrow, but what the Saudis are trying to do is trying to at least get the Palestinians not to come out too harshly. Now, without a Palestinian state, don't forget, this is a Palestinian leadership that were led to believe not too long ago that there'll be no normalization agreements with Israel. There'll be no peace agreements with Israel with any more members of the Arab world after Jordan and Egypt, obviously, without Palestinian state. That was what the Arab peace plan that was actually formulated in Saudi Arabia was all about. So the Palestinians have been sidelined by the Abraham Accords and everything else, and they're extremely worried about the normalization agreement, possible normalization agreement with Saudi Arabia. So the Saudis are trying to see what they can do to placate them. On the other hand, the Americans are trying to push Israel to see what they can do towards the Palestinians. And there were comments by Secretary Blinken, or at least reported comments, that said that if Israel believes that it's going to have normalization with the Saudis without taking some serious steps towards the Palestinians, then that's simply not on the table. And the problem that Netanyahu has, this is a Netanyahu who really does want the normalization with Saudi Arabia. He's been working very hard to it. This will be a crowning achievement of his leadership. Perhaps even, people have talked about it as his legacy. And he would make, I believe, serious steps, whether it's from Palestinians or other moves. He again has to worry about people like Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich, who this week came out, Finance Minister Smotrich, and said that I'm not prepared to take any steps towards the Palestinians as a quid pro quo for a Saudi agreement. In other words, Netanyahu has two parties to the far right of his coalition who are basically saying, for us, a Saudi agreement is not that important. They would like it and they would be happy if it happens, but they will not take the steps and not be part of a government that takes steps, that would take significant steps on the Palestinian issue to gain that normalization agreement. And this has led to a bit of a quandary for Netanyahu. And that is why the talk or the outreach to parties in the opposition has really turned up a notch recently. First of all, the anger about the judicial reform, it's not abated, but it certainly isn't at its peak because it's the summer, because the Knesset is not meeting, because there are no laws being passed. There is a feeling that perhaps there's an opportunity now to sort of do a grand deal, bring in someone from the opposition, jettison the far right from the current coalition, and then make it easier, more palatable for the normalization agreement. That is Netanyahu's big dream. At the moment, it doesn't seem like it's happening. Benny Gantz, the one that they're targeting the most, is not wilting. In fact, he's surging in the polls, or at least he's well ahead of the polls. So he has no particular interest in giving Netanyahu this lifeline. I was told by a very senior member of the opposition a few weeks ago that they believe this government will fall by the end of the calendar year. Now, I think that's a little bit optimistic because there's no particular reason, if Netanyahu doesn't take any serious steps on the Palestinian issue, if he does what's necessary just to keep his partners in line, there's no particular reason this government should fall. It's a government which doesn't need to pass a budget until the end of 2024, or in fact, early into 2025. It's a government, whose right-wing members have nowhere else really to go. So everything sort of hangs on whether Netanyahu can convince someone in the opposition, perhaps Benny Gantz, at some point, let's make a deal. Let's bring in judicial reform. Let's make a compromise on that. And then together we can bring about this peace with Saudi Arabia. Finally, before I go to questions, we have to talk about Hezbollah on the northern border. There is a lot of talk, there's a lot of heat on that border, as there has been for the last few months. There is talk within the defense establishment, not a matter of if, but a matter of when. Perhaps there's some sort of conflict with Hezbollah. The American negotiator, Hochstein, is in Lebanon at the moment. Defense Minister Gallant was in New York this week speaking with the UN Secretary General. A lot depends on a vote that's coming up on UNIFIL, which is the UN mission in southern Lebanon. There's a big debate exactly on its mission. In theory, it's supposed to calm things down on the border. It's supposed to monitor, observe, and be able to have freedom of movement. Now, when it was first given its mandate, it basically was not allowed to go into private land. And at the time of that mandate, that private land was relatively minimal. What Lebanon have done at the behest of Hezbollah has expanded the amount of private land all across the southern border with Israel, which means that UNIFIL has very little or far less ability to do its job. Now, what Israel is pushing for is for that mandate to be expanded to include the ability to also go into private land, whereas Lebanon and its allies are pushing the UN to severely limit it even further, basically make them a hostage of their own bases where they can only sort of just stay there and protect themselves and defend themselves, and give Hezbollah a lot more freedom of movement. It'd be interesting to see how this works its way out, because this will really show what Hezbollah's intentions are on the border. While, as I said, that there are many who believe that there will be a conflict coming soon, there are other analysts, let's say, who believe that Hezbollah don't want to initiate a conflict because they want to remain, or at least that Iran, those who direct them from Tehran, want Hezbollah's force to stay intact, its ability, its arsenal to stay intact, should Israel decide at some point that the Iranian nuclear weapons capability is at the point of no return, and it needs to take action. Tehran obviously want to keep Hezbollah's very significant arsenal there as a deterrent and to use it in such a case. So it'll be interesting to see how that plays it out. But there are many in Israel's the military establishment who believes that one wrong move from either side could see a fully fledged conflict on Israel's northern border. So we'll have to see what happens there. And with that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
All right, thank you so much. So the first question, so you mentioned that Netanyahu has been coming down hard on Eli Cohen. Eric would like to know, do you think Eli Cohen will be fired, and how does he defend the press release?
Well, let's start with the second part. I mean, it's a distract and deflect. He's basically blamed political adversaries for making a big deal out of it. I mean, it is a big deal. That's not a particularly good defense. But quite frankly, I'm not sure what defense he has other than that. So he's trying to make it a political thing that plays well into the base, as I was talking about. That plays really, the only people who buy into that is really like the hardcore Likudnik, Likud supporters who believe that everything, is just a political issue. It's clear that this is a problem. It's clear from Netanyahu's, sort of response that Eli Cohen, has been put in this place. I don't think he'll be fired over this, but certainly he'll be given a dressing down. I'm sure he'll be given less responsibility, even less than he had before. Perhaps sidelined. Perhaps Netanyahu believed this isn't someone he can trust. He put Eli Cohen there, not because Eli Cohen is a massive star in the Likud, but precisely because he's not. He's not someone who's a threat to Netanyahu. But if he makes Netanyahu look bad, especially on the world stage, that could be a problem. But I don't think he'll be fired at this point. That's my reading of the situation.
Thank you. Barak Korkmaz asks, do you think the Israeli-Saudi rapprochement would transform possible losers to aggressors, namely Iran and their proxies?
Would that make them more aggressive? Is that the question?
Transforming possible losers to aggressors.
Okay, if I understand the question, with that, it would change. It would change the makeup of the region, certainly, because to have Israel and Saudi Arabia openly, have relations in some respect, even though obviously things have moved on behind the scenes or even publicly. Israeli flights are allowed to go over Saudi airspace. There was a unique situation this week where a plane coming from the Seychelles back to Israel had to make an emergency landing in Jeddah, and they had to stay overnight. There was a lot of concern, but in the end, it took off the next morning. Apparently, everyone was treated very nicely by the Saudis, as expected. But what was interesting is it made history. The first flight from Jeddah to Tel Aviv. I mean, that was accidental, but still, the fact that it wasn't such a big deal is also, something of a big deal. And certainly, Iran and its proxies would lose out from this. There's very much a rivalry in the region between the Sunni leadership and the Shiite leadership. Obviously, we have Iran on one side and we have Saudis on the other. And also, if there was normalization, it would mean that the US would be giving Saudi Arabia a lot of defense promises, a lot of defense capabilities, and that could also shape the strategic outlook in the region, certainly to the detriment of the Iranians. Perhaps they'd feel more pressure from it. So obviously the Iranians are not particularly interested in this, and they would certainly lose out from such a deal.
Thank you. Don Sable would like to know, what can Israel possibly offer the Palestinians to satisfy the Saudis that would not be extremely dangerous towards the safety and security of Israel?
Well, I've said before, the Saudis aren't really that interested in the Palestinian issue. They pay lip service to it, and they know that domestically there are more extreme elements within Saudi Arabia that would need to be placated. But at the highest leadership, the Palestinian issue is not so important. But they probably feel, or they do feel, that there would need to be some gestures being made, because as I said, they're walking back on a position where they will not make peace without a Palestinian state. And this was actually stated on many occasions in the past. And then it was, downplayed, and now it's nowhere to be seen. I can't remember the last time I heard a senior Saudi official say that there will not be peace with Israel without a Palestinian state, a statement which is made by other countries. So it would be something very short of statehood. Perhaps, again, financial incentives, that's something that the Saudis can bring to the table, something which has been thrown in the direction of Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas. And probably there would have to be more freedom of movement. They'd probably have to make quite a few concessions on, maybe supporting the Palestinian Authority. Don't forget the Palestinian Authority is very weak. Mahmoud Abbas is very disliked. So perhaps there would be gestures that would help prop up Abbas. In fact, Netanyahu said not a few weeks ago that it's in Israel's interest to prop up the PA, to support it, to keep it stable, because there is a feeling that what would come in its stead would be much worse. So probably there would be gestures in that direction. But again, if they were anything beyond financial incentives, probably there would be quite a lot of pushback from the more right-wing members of his coalition, from the likes of Smotrich and Ben-Gvir.
Thank you. So early on, you were talking about the worldview of Israel. David Levine would like to know, Australia is now instructing its diplomats to refer to the West Bank as occupied areas. What, if anything, is Israel doing to confront and correct this?
Well, it's not for Israel. I mean, Israel has made the case for years, if not decades, that it does not see Judea and Samaria as occupied. It's made the case legally, it's made it diplomatically, politically, etc., etc. And up until recently, the Australians, don't forget that most of this is to do with domestic politics. You get a right-wing government, a more conservative government in Australia, and they say, we no longer consider Judea and Samaria occupied territories, and we will not refer to it as such. We'll call it disputed. Then you get a Labour government coming in, and it's more left-wing, and it's playing to its domestic audience, and now it's using the term occupied territories and West Bank and all these other terms. So most of it is to do with domestic politics. There's not much Israel can do. It can make its case, as it has done, but most of this is not a legal matter. It's not even a diplomatic matter. It's simply what the country's leadership needs to tell itself. It's a very easy thing to just fall into line with the vast majority of the world and say, we view Israel's presence in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, illegal. And thus, we call for a Palestinian state there. We call for Jerusalem as the capital of a future Palestinian state, etc., etc. It's very easy. Israel won't really retaliate significantly. It will continue to make its case. But I've been in enough meetings whereas the case was made extremely succinctly by Israel with the use of legal precedent and history. And it just simply falls on deaf ears, because at the end of the day, it's usually an internal decision, largely to placate domestic interests.
Thank you. And the final question of the day, Murray Feldman would like to know if you could please comment on the Biden meeting with Lapid and not Netanyahu yet. Is the pressure being put on Israel by Biden and Blinken going to push Israel away from the U.S.?
No. The meeting with Netanyahu will take place at some point. It's already been spoken about. Whether it will take place in D.C. or somewhere else remains to be seen. What is worrying, though, is on the other side is that let's say, for example, Defense Minister Gallant was in the US this week. Well, according to reports, he was not allowed to meet with his interlocutors or anyone in DC, anyone senior in DC, because the instruction has been given that no one should meet senior members of the Biden administration until Netanyahu has met with President Biden himself, which is a very damaging position, because you can imagine with someone like Defense Minister Yoav Gallant, someone who really needs to be meeting with the Defense Secretary, the US Defense Secretary, with National Security Council leadership, with perhaps, if not President Biden himself, certainly someone very, very close to him. And the fact that he was not allowed to do so because of this feeling that until Netanyahu gets the invite, no one should be in DC. Is on. By the way, Ron Dermer, as I said, has been in DC. He's allowed, but no one else is. So that's a major problem, especially with what's going on with Hezbollah, what's going on with Iran, what's going on with the PA, what's going on with Saudi Arabia. The defense minister needs to be meeting with as high level as possible. And we had this almost absurd episode where you had really second or third level leadership from the Biden administration coming to New York to meet with Israel's defense minister, which is a little bit absurd, a theater of absurd, some might suggest, because he simply was not really allowed to go to DC. And that can harm Israel's security if you're not allowed to meet at the highest level. And it's not something that's gone lost on the US. Is it putting pressure on the US to meet, on President Biden to meet with Netanyahu? I don't think so. I think President Biden wants to see a little bit more from Netanyahu diplomatically, domestically, politically, before that meeting really gets put firmly in the diary. But it's an uncomfortable situation. It's something which hopefully will be rectified soon because it's harming Israel's interests. And hopefully it will happen soon.
All right. Well, thank you so much. We've come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you for taking time to update us this week.
Thank you.
Of course. And for our viewers, thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.